It's hard not to be impressed by the sheer engineering power and work that goes into trenched fields of potatoes like this. The sheer horsepower alone in the tractor units that drive these units is staggering. But just look at this field. This is factory farming in its most intense form. Probably 20 to 22 acres on this site. And what's on the field now? We spotted a couple of crows, the odd pigeon and a lone partridge that looks a little bit lost. This is quite a barren landscape, and for the rest of this season this is going to be drenched in chemicals periodically, including fungicides, fertilizers, and then finally a defoliant. And it's probably going to take further biodiesel or red diesel to pump water on to this field for several weeks later in the season to maintain the bulking up of this crop. So there's consequences, and this soil, when you look at it, you come to realise it just contains nothing. Sorry, the dog's in the way, but it's sandy, dry sand. Any wildlife that was in this soil has been pulverised over the last 24 hours. The worm population decimated, the structure on that top 18 inches completely reorganised, and it's had very little in the way of organic matter or humus put in. That dry sand is so prone to erosion. It's a problem, but one we've got to have a look at a solution for and find a balance between cheap, reliable food production and the wildlife consequences for fields like this. Well, luckily I spotted these three just crossing the road and making their way across this recently ploughed and sown field before she did, and we managed to get her on a lead because she'd like nothing better than a good chase of one of those. It just goes to show some of the wildlife that you don't see all of the time until these fields are denuded in this way, and then all of a sudden cover's removed and they have to cross these big open expanses to get to the next area of woodland and safety. These are young roe deer. It's beginning of April now. The one in front is a young stag, and the two leading probably a mother and daughter from last season, but the mother will be pregnant at this time of year and likely to drop a foal at any time now. Another example of factory farming. A little confusing to some people, this one. You'd think that this farmer may have planted this run of sweet corn that's been left, or maize, over the winter months as a shelter belt and feeding ground for game birds. But actually this is where they're raising chicks for the shoot, and these areas again are purely for the production of these pheasants, and the rest of this probably 30 to 40 acre field barren monoculture, drenched in chemicals for the rest of the year, and the only belt remaining for these birds are the hedges and lanes and little areas of woodland that interconnect on these areas. She knows there's pheasants in there. Got to watch her because they will be nesting at this time of year, so she's not going to be allowed to get anywhere near them. And it's these areas of ancient woodland that crisscross the agricultural land here in Norfolk, which is the residing and saviour for the remaining wildlife that managed to inhabit this area. These joining runs of woodland allow wildlife to make its way undisturbed across large swathes of this county, and there remains unmanaged acres and acres of this type of woodland, which acts as a giant nature reserve for some of the larger mammals like those roe deer we showed you earlier. Just by leaving one of these hedgerows to grow up naturally, just look at the difference we've got here between the left-hand hedge, which has been flailed at the end of September or October, removing the majority of the fruiting spurs with berries and fruit on it, thus removing all the winter food for a lot of the birds and mammals that would be able to otherwise survive. And it's also removed all the flowering buds and growth from the previous year. So just look on the right, we've got the blackthorn now flowering, and later we'll have this maythorn, hawthorn. There's some hazel in here, witch hazel with the pussy hazel above me. We've got holly coming up and flowering later in the season, and a whole range of other hedging plants that are now going to come into flower and have fruited and have fed the wildlife in this band over the winter months. So a conservation management approach on the right, and a traditional English farming approach with its subsequent effects on the nature and wildlife around this area on the left. And here we have in the base of this unflailed hedge some evidence of wildlife living. You can see the burrow going in under this hazel tree there with the debris that's been excavated out, and surrounding it, just look at all these old corn or maize cobs that have been carried down here by whatever's living in there. And the path coming up here to cross the road, and the run going back up into the maize field beyond. Obvious evidence of something surviving and living here over winter, which is great. Again here, just a couple of yards further down, evidence of a really well used and frequented animal run coming out of that field under the hedge and making its way across the road and into the field beyond. But it's refreshingly fast how nature recovers and will grow back over a field that until just recently has been quite intensively farmed. And there's a growing movement in Norfolk to rewilding some areas, if not all, but trying to join these corridors together to give nature and the wildlife a chance and a habitat of conjoined environments that they can migrate through and utilise. And this is one example of such a field that's been unmanaged for a couple of years and is now returning to scrubland, and then shooting up amongst all these brambles will be young oaks and other saplings which will be protected by the thicket and grow away, not be eaten by the deer, and then this will return to woodland in as little as 10 to 15 years. Amazing.